On the limestone plateau that watched over the slow silver thread of the river, wind carried a fine taste of dust and salt and the hollow echo of footsteps across stone. Under the sun, the blocks gleamed, their faces warmed like bread, and in the shadows between tiers, the faint scent of cedar and bitumen lingered from rituals centuries old. Ancient writers spoke in equal parts awe and bewilderment. Herodotus had walked among these monuments and recorded what he saw with a mixture of reverence and speculation. Modern archaeologists would later lift the veil of centuries with trowel and ledger and radiocarbon, but a paradox remained. These stones proclaimed an order of power and devotion that suggested absolute control and precise planning, and yet many of the decisions that produced them were negotiated in moments of uncertainty and improvisation. How did a state gather surplus, coordinate artisans, and translate cosmology into mortar and axis long before industrial machines existed? Today, we trace the untold stories of one ruler who stands at the crossroads of ambition and craft, Pharaoh Seti, and the builders who turned ideas into monuments. We will move from the river basin to the workshops in the shadow of quarries, from ritual language invoking Ka and Ankh to the logistics that moved tons of limestone and granite. Will the figure of Seti emerge as a solitary genius, or as a node in a network of administrators, artisans, and common laborers? Prepare to listen to masonry chips fall like rain on a floor of history. The land itself explained much of what followed. Egypt was a narrow ribbon of fertility hugged by desert, a corridor that focused human effort along the floodplain of the Nile. The river shaped rhythm and economy. The inundation deposited silt that fed grain and cattle and allowed villages to become towns. Compared with contemporaneous civilizations in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean, the Egyptian environment encouraged continuity and centralization. Where river complexity favored fragmented polities elsewhere, the Nile's predictable annual rise enabled surplus planning and institutional accumulation across long stretches of time. Climatic shifts mattered too. Periods of relatively reliable floods allowed the state to feed large workforces and to develop public works that in turn reinforced state authority. Topography guided transport routes. The proximity of limestone quarries and granite sources influenced the placement of necropolises and workshop hubs. Compare the plateau of Giza with the necropolis at Saqqara, and a pattern appears. Choices about burial location, about the orientation of a temple, and about the allocation of stone reflect both symbolic cosmology and pragmatic access to resources. These decisions were not abstract, they were responses to light, wind, the feel of clay on a farmer's palm, the taste of salted fish after long days on barges, and to the calendars kept by priests who watched the star Sirius rise as a promise of fertility. At the center of that system lay the cycle of inundation. Each year, waters rose and fell with a reliability that shaped ritual and economy. The inundation functioned as a natural tax collector, depositing fertile loam that fed fields and freed hands for construction. Priestly calendars recorded the flood levels, and scribes converted those observations into timetables for planting, for corvée, and for mobilizing gangs of workers. The Nile's rhythm also encoded religious meaning. Flood and receding waters were woven into cosmology as an act of balance between gods such as Ra and Osiris, a visible proof of the gods' favor or their displeasure. Farmers read the signs of low water with dread and administrators with haste because failed inundations meant lower yields and pressure on grain stores that underpinned public works. The river also served as a highway. Barges laden with casing stones and with cedar and rebar transported heavy loads to sites that would otherwise be impossible to supply. The hydraulic logic of the Nile made eruptions of construction feasible during specific seasons, and shaped the very vocabulary of power that rulers like Seti invoked when erecting obelisks and sanctuaries. Before dynasties hardened into lists and kings into monumental names, there was a long pre-dynastic era in which communities along the riverbanks settled, adopted pottery styles, and animated mortuary practices. Sedentarization turned mobile bands into villages and then towns, producing specialization and the first scribes. Innovations accumulated. Early forms of writing, proto-hieroglyphic signs scratched on pottery, led to the more stable script that recorded administration and liturgy. The social aggregation around temple precincts produced a class of priests, overseers, and artisans who gradually formed institutions that could marshal labor. Narmer, sometimes called Menes in later lists, emerges in memory as a figure associated with unification, a symbolic threshold. The consolidation of authority around centers like Memphis created administrative templates, the vizier and the nome governors or nomarchs, who would be crucial centuries later. The adoption of particular burial types, such as the mastaba, reflected not only an ideology about the afterlife, but also investment in stone and labor. Over time, funerary architecture evolved into projects that expressed political control and a language of eternity. These early shifts prepared the ground upon which later rulers, including Seti, would build their claims to cosmic and temporal order. The first great architectural leaps came when mastaba tombs were reimagined and stacked, forming the first monumental step structures. The step pyramid at Saqqara is a testament to the leap from simple burial mounds to complex stone architecture. Imhotep, the architect, healer, and priest associated with Djoser, became a legendary figure for bridging craft and sacred knowledge. His innovations introduced stone as a durable medium for royal memory and for the staging of ritual. But building in stone required not just imagination, it required new logistics and new social agreements. Craftsmen learned quarrying, dressing, and placement techniques. Tools evolved: copper saws and dolerite pounders, and abrasive sand. Workshops emerged near raw materials and near construction sites. Patterns traveled. The template of the tomb metamorphosed into geometric. Experiments that culminated in smooth-faced pyramid forms centuries later. Each stage of evolution reflected changing religious priorities and expanding administrative capacity and the willingness of elites to mobilize surplus for monuments that declared authority into the next life. That technical trajectory found later expression in the era of Sneferu and peaked in projects associated with the name Khufu, yet the New Kingdom, signal of pharaohs such as Seti, adopted and repurposed that architectural memory. Sneferu's experiments moved from stepped profiles to bent experiments and finally to the true pyramid face, a sequence of trial and correction that taught lessons about load distribution and bedding courses. Sneferu's work demonstrated that large-scale transition required deliberate planning, the testing of angles and core techniques to stabilize faces and to prevent catastrophic slippage. The lessons of those experiments circulated through generations of masons and surveyors, refining the practices of quarrying, cutting, dressing, and lifting. When Khufu's project launched, a later state saw the cumulative power of knowledge recorded in accounts and in the materiality of workyards. But the story of Seti is not simply repetition. Seti drew upon memory and innovation. He worked in a landscape that already carried ideas of monumental kingship and funerary scale, and he made decisions that intertwined devotion with statecraft. His monuments were statements of legitimacy, but also of technical competence. Logistics were central. Transport of granite from Aswan required careful planning of barges, seasonal windows, and precise knowledge of the river's behavior. Workers were not mythical hordes. Evidence increasingly shows specialized laborers living in organized villages, receiving rations, medical care, and rotation. Labor was controlled by institutions that balanced reward and obligation rather than by simple models of slavery. Seti's personal history shaped his approach as ruler and patron. Born into a family that rose in the wake of turbulent succession, Seti received training both in military affairs and in religious office. His adolescence was spent in the shadow of temples, where he memorized hymns, and in the field where he watched logbooks of campaigns return with lists of captives and tribute. As prince, he witnessed the negotiation between energetic generals and cautious scribes and learned the value of alliances with powerful nomarchs who could provide labor and grain when needed. The turning point in his life came during a border skirmish that cost him a close friend, a commander named Merib, one of the first losses that taught him the limits of martial glory. In the quiet after that event, Seti began to invest in monumental works as instruments of stability and memory rather than as mere trophies. In adulthood, he cultivated men of letters such as the scribe Kamwaset and craftsmen like the master mason Hapu to create a network that bridged ideology and technique. These choices made him an executor of state art whose projects reflected both personal grief and political prudence. Seti's backstory unfolded across 3 stages: the child of a family newly elevated, and rank. He learned ritual and the arithmetic of grain quotas in Memphis temples. The young adult phase found him campaigning in Sinai and the Levant, where coalitions taught him diplomacy and logistics. The mature phase showed a ruler who, shaped by loss and tempered by administration, turned attention to durable monuments and to the patronage of artisans. Each stage contributed to a worldview that combined reverence for tradition with an appetite for technical problem-solving. That composite identity produced a pharaoh who was at once pious, confident, and meticulous, preferring plans that left records for future generations. Across Seti's reign, several named figures appeared consistently in archival fragments and in later inscriptions. Ramesses, a predecessor, and the elder Ramesses, perhaps his kin, provided lines of dynastic continuity against which Seti defined himself. The scribe Kayemwaset acted as both antiquarian and temple restorer, documenting older inscriptions. The master mason Hapu oversaw quarry gangs and taught lifting techniques. Vizier Panefsi administered grain stores and coordinated corvée timetables. Commander Merib, whose early death influenced Seti's patronage of sanctuaries, figures in military dispatches. The priestess Wajet served as an intermediary in ritual sequences that sanctified construction. These 5 to 8 secondary characters reappeared across the narrative as concrete agents, not as shadowy footnotes. Their names and actions show how a network of people, rather than a single hand, carved the memory of a ruler into stone. A technical aside on archaeological practice clarifies how modern scholars reconstruct these stories. Excavations proceed layer by layer, with stratigraphic control, mapping each soil horizon and artifact context. Carbon samples are taken from organic remains for calibration curves, while petrographic analysis identifies quarry provenance. GIS mapping and 3D photogrammetry allow reconstruction of architecture and transport routes. Such methods make it possible to match a casing stone to a known quarry and to date workshop activity by analysis of waste flakes and bread ovens. This procedural description compresses into a few lines the careful protocols that produce secure inferences about past labor and technique. We should pause and invite your participation. At this point, you may be considering what surprised you most: the scale, the religion, or the human organization. Tell us what struck you. Was it logistica, the orchestration of barges and grain, or was it religion, the cosmology that made permanence a duty? Answer starting with one of those prompts, and keep it short. The best comments help other viewers and can shape future episodes. Some of our most cited episodes emerged from community suggestions, and a good comment might inspire a deep dive into quarry logistics or into the biographies of artisans. Now we return to the story and to the month when Seti initiated a program of restoration and new construction that tested every link in the chain from quarry to temple. A moment of tension emerged early in one construction season, when unexpected low inundation reduced available grain and strained corvée rosters. The state archives recorded a spike in petitions from nome officials and a wave of thefts in supply depots. Seti convened a council where Panesi the vizier argued for ration cuts, while Kayemwaset insisted on delaying non-essential work to preserve ritual calendars. The debate shifted between moral and pragmatic claims. The crown's legitimacy depended on visible piety, but urban unrest could threaten supply lines. In that charged room, the smell of incense mixed with sweat and the whisper of papyri as scribes adjusted columns of numbers. Ultimately, Seti authorized a targeted suspension of some projects and redirected grain from border garrisons to core temples, a compromise that reflected political acumen but that left local leaders resentful. Another high-tension episode followed the discovery of structural fissures in a chapel flank intended to receive a colossus. Masons reported hairline cracks that widened after a night rain, which suggested water infiltration from an ancient channel. Hapu, the master mason, stood with a trowel, light catching on his calloused fingers, as he described the failure to the pharaoh. Panels of sandstone had shifted because the original bedding had embedded pockets of soft grit. The repair plan required diverting precious granite beams from an ocular sanctuary and mobilizing cordage teams to haul weights up newly constructed ramps. The atmosphere was tight, the taste of dust sharp in the mouths of workers, and the clank of stone against stone like distant thunder. Seti had to choose between aesthetic continuity and structural integrity, a decision with consequences for both ritual meaning and the safety of laborers. A central scene brings us close to the core of material practice through an extended dialogue between the pharaoh, the vizier, the master mason, the head scribe, the foreman, and a priest. The conversation contains a dozen exchanges and reveals how decisions emerged. Seti said, "We will align the sanctuary with the rising star and not with the street." Panesi answered, "That will require shifting the foundation eastward and 8 more days of work." Hapu said, "The core must be staggered and bedded with packed limestone chips, or the face will bulge." The head scribe called, "For accounting, we note an extra 5,000 worker days and an increase in grain allotments." The foreman said, "Our teams can manage if we borrow crews from the Nile transport gang." The priest warned, "If the axis is wrong, the ritual sequence for the festivals will be disrupted." Seti replied, "The festival must proceed. We will not let cosmic order be broken." Panesi argued, "It is political risk to remove crews from the river during shipment season." Hapu countered, "The ramp can be extended and the stone moved at night to ease river traffic." The head scribe added, "Night work will cost more, but keep the timetable." The foreman said, "We will need more rope and new lubricants." The priest concluded, "Then we must sanctify the new ramp and invoke protection for the workers." Seti closed, "And so we do both technique and prayer." The exchange reveals how ritual, symbolic, and material logics were negotiated in real time with sensory notes of night air, tar on rope, the smell of oil, and the weighty thud of stone into place. Scenes of workers reveal smaller dialogues and the texture of daily life in the village that supported construction. Those conversations typically run 6 to 8 turns and show intimacy and coordination. A mason said, "The granite block is rough but true." A carver answered, "Bring more emery and I will refine the face." A baker called, "Out front, 5 loaves of barley are ready for the crew." A medic said, "The man with the cut needs stitches and ribs must be bandaged." A younger apprentice said, "I fear the ramps are too steep." The mason reassured, "Use the angle with planks and the pulley will balance the load." The baker laughed and handed bread, and the medic smiled at the communal respite. These exchanges carry the taste of bread, the heat of the midday sun, and the sting of dust in the throat. The life of workers in their village formed a crucial human dimension. Excavations of barracks, ovens, and bakeries show organized meals, rations lists, and medical treatments. Laborers rotated in and out of heavy work in cycles, and specialized teams handled quarrying, dressing, hauling, and finishing. Women in the community maintained supply chains, producing textiles and fetching water, while scribes kept careful registries of days worked and commodities exchanged. The sensory register included the clang of metal, the sour sweetness of beer, the sharp scent of oil on ropes, and the soft particulate hand dust that settled on hair and garments. By the time Seti's major sanctuary neared completion, his initiatives attracted both praise and rivalry. Inscriptions ordered restoration of older monuments, a policy that appealed to Khamwaset's antiquarian interests, while building new obelisks that declared a renewed claim to the sun god Ra. Seti's iconography emphasized continuity with past dynasties and the legitimacy of his line. He used titles that invoked the eternal name and the efficacy of Ka to bind memory to place. Monumental acts had political meaning beyond the stones. They asserted control over memory and landscape, and they redistributed surplus in ways that reinforced networks of patronage. The later decades of the pharaonic chronology show how cycles of centralization and fragmentation altered the capacity to carry out large-scale works. Old Kingdom models of centralized control and massive pyramid projects give way in later eras to different balances of power. By comparing the Old Kingdom examples of massed necropolises with the monuments of Seti, we see continuity in vocabulary and divergence in technique. The mobilization practices of Seti relied on a more complex administration, with named viziers and an increasingly literate bureaucracy that could manage the grain flows and worker rotations necessary for sustained campaigns of construction and repair. The political rise of local elites, or nomarchs, at times challenged royal prerogative, creating moments where compromise rather than command defined project outcomes.
Interpretations of labor have evolved. Earlier narratives focusing on forced mass labor have given way under archaeological evidence to more nuanced models of skilled, seasonal labor supported by rations, medical care, and hierarchical organization. Excavations of workers' villages show inscriptional evidence that names craftsmen and records their contributions. This human detail changes how we read monuments. They are not only transcripts of power, they are also archives of communal effort and the material traces of daily life. Throughout this account, we have touched on controversies. Some scholars emphasize the centrality of religion in motivating construction, others highlight economic incentives and political strategies. Debates over the exact methods used to move the largest stones between Aswan and Memphis persist, with competing reconstructions based on ramp models, sledges, and lubrication techniques. Alternative readings suggest the symbolic program of a monument matters as much as its logistical program. Our stance is critical and synthetic, combining documentary evidence with material analysis and recording where interpretations diverge. In technical terms, the quarrying and transport logistics consisted of cutting blocks with dolerite hammers and lifting them onto sledges, greasing the route with a water-sand mixture, and using teams of oxen and men to haul loads to river barges. Barges were loaded with block by block over secured cradles and navigated during the high Nile season to sites where temporary docks permitted unloading. Erecting an obelisk involved careful tapering, balancing, and the placement of levers and earthen ramps that detained the stone until final setting. These brief processual steps hide months of planning and thousands of hours of labor. As ruin and repair cycle downstream, so too did Seti's monuments age and generate their own afterlives. By the time of the decline of centralized authority following prolonged droughts and political fragmentation, the resources for large-scale projects became scarce. The story of decline contains lessons about the fragility of systems based on climatic stability and on networks of trust and obligation. A reflective conclusion looks back across the plateau to the first sensory image and draws together meaning. Standing again among the faces of stone, we feel the abrasion of wind, the warmth of sun on calcite, and the resonance of a name chiseled deep into memory. The legacy of Seti is neither pure monument nor solely memory. It is a hybrid enterprise of political message, technical achievement, and human labor. 1 month after the last ritual and the completion of a sanctuary, archaeologists from later ages would find tool marks and bread ovens that confirmed the scale of organization. In that first month, local priests consolidated records and pilgrims began to attach new layers of devotion to the site. The living remembered the festivals, and the calendar kept by scribes recorded minor repairs undertaken as seasonal tasks. 1 month later, the site hummed with practical aftercare and with a ritual rhythm that embedded the new building within the landscape. 3 months after that completion, more substantive analysis had begun. Craftsmen had reported settling cracks,
and the archivists produced logs that reconciled grain expenditures with labor rosters. Scholars from neighboring nomes came to consult the restoration records, and the debates about whether to replicate certain architectural features spread through administrative correspondence. A public controversy arose about whether diverted grain had affected harvest outcomes in outlying provinces, and the Central Archive appended correspondence that would trouble future historians. In these 3 months, the monument ceased to be only a royal statement and became a site of contested responsibilities and a node in wider provincial networks. 6 months on, a longer-term pattern appeared. Children of workers had learned parts of craft technique as apprentices. Some temporary laborers had settled and opened small workshops, and local cultic practices incorporated the sanctuary into their seasonal observances. The broader economic system showed strains in some nomes where tribute flows had not fully recovered, but resilience appeared in improved record-keeping and in an emergent class of skilled artisans who traveled between sites. The 6-month span illustrated how monuments catalyzed social change not merely aesthetically, but in labor organization, education, and in the small economies that grew around construction. Finally, we return to the question that opened this journey. What did Seti's monuments truly build beyond stone? They constructed a lineage of authority, a set of technical knowledges, and a community of labor and ritual that lasted far beyond a single reign. They remind us that the history of ancient Egypt is as much about the people who cut, dressed, and placed stones as it is about the names cut into them. The stones themselves remain a testimony to coordination, to the river that made surplus possible, and to the cosmologies that gave work its meaning. For you looking at these monuments, what defines a civilization well run? Is it its ability to coordinate resources, its imaginative religious commitments, or the dignity it afforded to people who labored? Share your thought beginning with one word, logistics, or religion, or labor, and tell us briefly why. If this story interested you, subscribe for more narrative archaeological accounts that bring technique and humanity together, and follow-up episodes will dig deeper into quarry logistics, crew organization, and the biographies of artisans who underwrote the memory of kings.